Hey everyone, welcome to our first expert webinar in the Secure and Private AI Challenge Scholarship Program. I'm really sorry for the mess up that happened earlier. So this is the official link for joining in the webinar, and you can actually move away from the goal setting webinar and come here instead. Okay. So guys, also if some of you missed the initial part of the program, I will be repeating it again for you guys, and there will also be a recording for this session after the session. So not to worry about that. Okay, so starting this again, welcome to our first expert webinar. Today we have Robert Wagner, commonly known as Bobby. Bobby joining us today for an AMA session with you guys. So thank you so much, Bobby, for joining us today and taking out the
Thank
time
you for having
for
me.
answers. Awesome. Taking out the time to answer the questions that students have. So I think it's really important for our students to know how to contribute to open source, how to get their jobs via open source and keep contributing it to gain knowledge from that. So I think students are really excited here, and without taking much time, I will definitely give out the stage to you. But before that, I will just lay out the agenda for today's webinar for you guys, okay? So firstly, Robert will talk about how he started contributing to open source and how he got his first job as an open source contributor. So he'll be walking you through that. Then next up is his contributions to the OpenMined community and his work as a release manager there. So thirdly, we'll have the questions that we compiled from you guys before the webinar, and I will be asking those live to Robert, and he will be answering those. And lastly, if we will be left with any time, we'll be taking up some questions on the live chat as well. So please, guys, do remember to drop in questions there when asked. Okay, guys. So I won't take much time right now. Robert, the stage is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the great introduction. So how I got my start developing open source software was I was a student in college, and after a year of searching for a summer internship, didn't manage to get one in tech. I was studying computer science, and the internship I ended up getting was I was moving furniture for the school I went to. And because of that, I had a lot of time on my hands to focus on more intellectually simulating things. And during that time, I ended up finding OpenMined on Twitter. And when I found out OpenMined, I thought, wow, this can't be real. But I joined the Slack and started contributing. My first contribution wasn't really focused on the technical side of things. I started off by making a couple changes to documentation, just doing kind of whatever I could to get involved. And sort of as time went on, I started taking on bigger and bigger parts of the project, and in a lot of ways, tried to see how I could use it to fulfill my requirements for school. For example, right after I started contributing to OpenMined, my school offered a course in data privacy. And for that course, I ended up implementing the first SMPC implementation within OpenMined, which, having kind of that time crunch, and it was a bit of an ambitious project for that class, made it very easy to stay involved and keep contributing. After contributing to open source, I actually ended up getting my first job through open source. Through contributing to OpenMined, the company that I work for now was looking for people with experience working on federated learning. And they had found OpenMined, which in turn led them to starting a conversation with me, which is now what I do day to day, is writing federated learning code, which has been super fun so far.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bobby. So I think it's also really important the kind of work that you do with the Open Mind community and what you're doing there as a release manager. Because right now, most of our students are actually engaged in the Open Mind community, and they're currently part of the Slack workspace there as well. So can you just tell us something about what's happening there in the community and some things like meetups or maybe how they can actually contribute to the Open Mind GitHub workspace and those kind of things?
Sure. Speaking of sort of how to start contributing, one huge thing I want to plug within the OpenMined community is recently the RISE Foundation has very generously offered a couple scholarship grants to start contributing to open source. Those applications are still open for another couple of days, and I'll see if I can put a link in the chat here for where you can find the projects and sort of the application process for those. As far as what I do at OpenMined with regards to release management is, it turns out that there's a lot of time that needs to be spent on not necessarily the code side of code, but more the how you get code to people side of code. So as my role as release manager, I'm responsible for taking the code that lives in master and getting it up on PyPy so that people can just run pip install PySift. The other big part of that is working on setting up tools for automated testing so that we know that the code that we're putting out there at least meets some basic quality standards. Outside of release management at OpenMined, I'm also heading up a lot of our federated learning projects in conjunction with my day job working on federated learning, which is a bunch of fun. As far as getting started with contributing to OpenMined, the biggest thing is just jumping in. A lot of times there's a list of issues that you can find on the OpenMined repository that in a lot of cases are a good place to start. And with a lot of those issues, there may be people working on them, but a big question is just like, hey, how can I help? Like, what can I do to make it easier so that we can get this code out into the open? Another big thing is just becoming involved with the community. There's a lot of people who have questions in the community or are having trouble with something. And the more people who sort of know about the code and have looked into the code and can help try to answer those questions, the easier it is for more people to start up with, one, contributing to open source, and two, with using PySift.
Yeah, definitely.
Having,
I think, as you said, community is one of the most important aspects for the students here, and like most of our questions get answered through community. So, definitely, a really great advice for our students here. Like, really sorry, really informed.
Yeah, especially on the topic of community, like community is one of the biggest reasons that I've stayed contributing to OpenMined this entire time. Like for the past 2 years, like I've made friends through OpenMined, like had countless like experiences that never would have happened outside of it. And a lot of that is just because of the great community surrounding it.
Yeah. I know, I definitely know about it because I too was a part of one community before I joined Udacity, and I think community aspect of things really pays out when you're working out as a developer, and especially if you're working in group projects. So definitely that also pays out in the community. Thank you so much, Robert, for sharing those insights. I'm sure like our students would definitely benefit from your words here. And I think moving forward, it's best that we move on to the questions that our students gave us because we are low on time and definitely our students gave us a lot of questions today. And I'm really sorry that you might have to take out a little more time and answer these.
It's quite all right.
Awesome.
Let's dive into the questions then.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the first question that we have is from Saurav Kumar. So he asks, how as an open mind community member, you see privacy importance in research work people are doing at big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon that takes a lot of sensitive data to improve their products?
So the big idea behind developing tools for privacy preserving machine learning is not to make it so that we can't learn the things that we're learning now within like those big tech companies. The idea behind implementing tools for privacy preserving machine learning is to make it so that we can still like create all these wonderful models that are making it easier to do things in our daily lives, but without necessarily having the trade-off where people's privacy has to be compromised. And there's a lot of work being done at some of these larger tech companies to start moving towards having more privacy preserving machine learning. Like the classical example of this is Google a couple years ago created federated learning for use within Gboard. so that they didn't have to collect everything people were typing while still getting those good language models for computers.
Awesome. I really hope that that answers Saurabh's question here. Another question that we have is from Shen Wei. So I think this is a really awesome question. I understand that there are built-in local differential privacy setting in a mobile device. However, how can a layman end user can make sure the privacy algorithm sitting in their device is working fine? How can they verify that the device manufacturers are not making false claims?
That's a great question. In a lot of ways, the biggest, like one of the biggest boons to verifying that code is working as intended is having that code be open source. When code is open source, people a lot smarter than you and I can go through and verify a lot of the properties of it. But the question of how do you verify that the code you're running actually does what it says it is a huge problem. And it's still very much an open research question.
Great.
So work in that space is consistently ongoing, and in a lot of ways will always continue to be ongoing.
Great. We have another question from Saurav here. So, what are the big and major changes you expect to see how general people would feel about their privacy in the technology in the coming 5 years?
So I think we've seen. I'm currently based in the U.S., so a lot of my opinions on this are more U.S. centric. But I think in general we've seen a lot over the past couple of years with things like GDPR, where especially people in Europe are pushing for more privacy regulation. I think a lot of what comes going forward with people's opinions about privacy is really just a lot of the things that are coming out about how their privacy is compromised by some of the like leaks and such we've had recently. And I think a lot of going forward is just going to be having better messaging around how that actually affects people's daily lives. So I think we as a whole will become more privacy conscious. It's a lot of just starting that conversation and saying, okay, like we've been aware some of this is a problem, but here's how it actually affects you. Um, and I think work in like continuing that conversation is incredibly valuable. That a lot of things on the privacy side aren't necessarily a technical problem. They're more of just a public perception problem in that a lot of these technical solutions get solved when people start to think about these problems more.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think the first step should be taken by the people themselves here. And if they can actually pass out the great feedback and to the people, so the people who are managing these technologies, I'm sure that in the coming few years, those changes might not be very big or major. They might be very considerable. So definitely agree to your answer here. We have another question. We have one question from Swapnil here. So I will restructure the question a bit. So, can open source contribution in ML help me for a PhD in vision in data science?
So, in my personal opinion, or I guess experience, contributions to to open source software have been very helpful in both a career and graduate school course or in search. So, in my personal opinion, most of the interviews for graduate school and for jobs have been focused around okay, tell me about something that you've done before. And contributing to open source in a lot of ways functions a lot like a job in machine learning, in that in a lot of cases, you're working with people from across the globe to write software that does something. And in a lot of ways, you can talk about those experiences much like you would talk about your experiences within a job. So, in like, I guess going back to the original question, contributing to open source is very helpful for those type of things because it gives you something more to talk about so that you can push so that when you're doing these interviews, you're able to say, here's what I've done and here's how it applies. And since the code is open source, in a lot of ways, it's very easy to verify that, yes, you have done that, and yes, that is how it applies. That was a great question.
Okay, so moving forward, we have one question from Kalinkan here. So obviously, I will definitely read out the whole question here. Hi Wagner, I'm very happy that we have the great opportunity to ask questions to you. And so his question is kind of like a two-parter here. How was your first job interview for the position of ML? What specifically appreciated the employer to hire you? And the second is for the first job in ML, did you had a portfolio, like a project portfolio, for example, Kaggle projects?
Um, so starting with the second question, I unfortunately haven't done anything on Kaggle. So my portfolio for those type of projects was severely lacking. My portfolio is mostly focused around the open source software that I'd written that ended up being about 2 years of work in more developing machine learning infrastructure tools. In a lot of ways, for this past like recruitment cycle, I actually ended up having a lot of different interviews with a couple different places, and they all kind of went different. With my current employer, it was more focused on culture than anything, since they had already seen basically the past 2 years of my work, and it was less a question of the technical side of things and more just a question of how we work together. Um, but for a lot of the other interviews I had, it was more focused on, okay, just let's talk about a project that you've worked on the past couple of years and like what some of the challenges you had and how you got through that. And then also just some technical ML problems, which I don't think I can talk about in detail. But that was kind of my experience with interviewing.
Great. Moving on to the next question, we have one question from Rishi S. Rao. So I think this gets a little specific. So I want to contribute to the PySift project. How should I proceed? What should I read up? And how do I get to understand with what understanding the base API are designed and written in the framework?
So getting started with PySwift in a lot of cases is finding a good first issue or focusing very narrowly on the project. PySwift has evolved over the past couple of years to a point where it's very hard to spin up on the project in general, but very easy to spin up on very specific problems. Like, for example, if you want to start contributing secure computation code, it's most of the secure computation code is very easy to find and very easy to look at what needs to be done. And like the person to talk to about that would be Teo Rafael, who's very active in the Slack. Another great way to start contributing is just if you see a problem that starts to be annoying to you, like say you're working through the Udacity course and you run across a bug, just trying to fix that bug itself, like tracing back up the stack until you figure out what actually is the problem, is another great way to start figuring out the code base. Yeah. So that's kind of my take on how to start contributing. And in a lot of ways, like just if you see an issue that you want to contribute to, just saying, all right, how can I help to the person who's sort of driving that issue, in a lot of ways is a great way to get started. Because most of the time they'll be like, okay, here's one particular thing that's been giving me trouble. If you could solve that, that'd be wonderful.
Awesome. So I think we'll move on to the next question now. We have one question from Rena Talal. So machine learning engineers being one, what other domain experts are needed or involved to maintain a library such as PySift?
So PySift, in a lot of ways, a ton of the code doesn't really have to do with machine learning. Some of the biggest problems in privacy preserving machine learning is finding ways to communicate with machines that are across the world in a way that's secure. So a lot of the work is actually done on very traditional like back-end engineering and like network engineering that doesn't have a ton to do with machine learning. Uh, and then on top of that, there's also we're recently started growing our support out into JavaScript and Swift and Java so that people can perform privacy preserving machine learning in the browser or on a phone. So experience with developing like mobile apps or with browser technologies is also super helpful with contributing to PySIFT. Pretty much any particular skill set is useful. It's just finding out where in the project that skill set is useful.
Awesome. So another question from Temito. So, what robotics projects can I do with federated learning?
Um, so a lot of my experience with robotics is fairly limited. With a lot of federated learning is most useful when data is distributed. So in a lot of cases, if you have multiple robots, but you want to learn across sort of all the data they've collected, but you don't want to move it to one place, that's a huge place where federated learning could be useful. Um, yeah.
Awesome. So,
Uh,
another question from Frida. I'm really sorry, Frida. There's a really big question and it gets really specific, but maybe I can take this question offline from for you and you can answer this afterwards. Okay. Okay. Move on to the next question now. Uh, what tips will you give to newbies to open source? Where does one begin from there? This is a question from Mansik Goel.
so my biggest tip would just be to dive in. In a lot of cases, like just writing something, no matter what it is a huge first step. Another huge tip for that is just keep in mind that you are not your code. So, in a lot of ways, when you first start writing software, people will give you feedback on the code that you're writing. And in a lot of cases, it probably won't be very positive. However, most of the time, that feedback is designed just to help you grow as a person. And it's not a criticism of you, but more a criticism of that particular code and how you can improve it to make it better. And like by paying attention to that feedback, in a lot of ways, it's very helpful to grow as a software engineer.
Great. Another question from Saurav here. So, hi Robert, can you tell us what inspires you the most to learn and work in the AI field?
So the biggest inspiring thing for me is just trying to solve problems that haven't been solved before. Or if the problem has been solved before, making it very easy for other people to come through and not have to put the effort into solving that problem. So one of the biggest motivators for me contributing to PySIFT, for example, is that a lot of the things for federated learning and differential privacy have some solutions, but they're a pain to have to implement from scratch every time. So if you can make it just so it's very easy to import something, I get very happy about making it easier for people to promote privacy.
Great. We have another question from Udajya. So, Udajya, again, Robert, so these are really amazing questions, but a little lengthy. So maybe I can take these questions offline with you and you can answer them afterwards. Would that work?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
That sounds great.
Moving forward, so we have a question from Matthews. I'm building an autonomous wheelchair. What would you do to protect the dataset privacy? So to give you a little insight of who Matthews is this is an awesome student on our community who's actually working on creating this autonomous wheelchair for all the people out there, all the physical challenged people out there, and he's doing an amazing job in this regard. And I'll definitely send you a story regarding his story. And there's a blog post that we published, and
That's awesome.
I'm sure you definitely feel great when you connect with him.
Yeah, for promoting or protecting data
So
privacy.
just repeating the question once again. Oh, great, you got the question. Really sorry.
Sorry, following up on that question, for protecting data privacy in pretty much any application, It really depends on where the data is coming from. So if, for example, with this autonomous wheelchair use case, if you're collecting all the data yourself, in a lot of cases, all you need to do to protect that privacy is keep it encrypted when you're not using it, so that you're not vulnerable to like very standard data leaks. With But if like the data is coming from a bunch of different sources, there's several techniques you can use, such as federated learning and differential privacy, that can be used to protect that data ahead of time. A lot of times with protecting data privacy, it more comes down to the questions of where is the data coming from and in what form will people be able to access the data when the model's trained. Like if nobody's actually getting to feed raw inputs into the model, a lot of these problems go away.
Great. So we have a question from Labiba here. Hi, we're very glad to meet you here with us. I'd really love if to know if you could tell us about your motivation behind starting your career as a researcher. Was it always your goal to become a researcher?
So going back several years, I knew consistently that I wanted to work on problems in like software, and in prior to a couple years ago, I was very focused on creating tools for use with neuroscience. I got my start in research working on brain-computer interfaces to help people with quadriplegia restore limb function. Um, so I always had a strong interest in research per se. I didn't expect to be going into machine learning research at this point. So a lot of it was just getting very involved with more research type projects and realizing that I liked it.
Great. So I have a question from Boris Renwa here, and it's absolutely fine if you don't want to tell this, but I think the students are really digging into it. So, does OpenMind use TensorFlow's federated learning module under the hood, or it's their own implementation?
So at the moment, we currently don't use TensorFlow federated under the hood. There is some plans in the long run to sort of merge the code bases of TensorFlow federated and PySift in order to sort of leverage the best of both worlds. But that isn't the case at the moment. Um, Looking into sort of how those different libraries could interact would be a great way, like a very involved way to start contributing to open source, but would be a very valuable contribution in the long run.
Awesome. So I'm having two questions here from Nishant and Balarinva again. So first question is from Nishant. I want to contribute in the PyTorch, but I'm unable to. I don't know how to begin my journey here. Can you please guide me here? And the second question is, why does OpenMind or PyTorch does not take part in GSOC, Google Summer of Code?
So going to the second question first, the reason we didn't participate in Google Summer of Code is we didn't think of it at the time. Going forward, that definitely would be something we'd be interested in participating. It just wasn't a priority this year. Is applying for those type of things takes time, and we were focused on other things at the time. Um, as far as how to start contributing to PyTorch, or not PyTorch, PySift. As I was saying earlier, jumping into sort of those good first issues, or just trying to start solving problems that you're running into using the code base are huge places to start. One of the biggest contributions, or one of the most helpful things people can do at the moment with PySift is just to use it how they'd want to use it. When we're writing tests for things and setting up this code, a lot of times we're not necessarily thinking of every different way someone would try to use the code. So by using the code, a lot of ways you might trigger bugs that we wouldn't have come across otherwise, which are a huge place to get started. Um, I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Okay,
It's all good.
we have a question from Mars here. What's the scope and the long-term motive of this field, the secure and private AI field? And can you just give some examples, like what kind of things would can we expect in the future, and like so those
Uh,
sort of things?
so, sort of in my personal opinion, the biggest country or the biggest next steps in the field of privacy preserving machine learning are mostly focused on making things faster. Um, the biggest thing with, or the biggest drawback to privacy preserving machine learning is that it imposes a speed penalty when you're trying to do things. Since when you have to send things over the network, there's only so fast you can send that information, which in a lot of cases is a lot slower than you can do local computation. The other big advantage or advances I think will come out of privacy preserving machine learning is within the field of differential privacy, finding ways to minimize the amount of noise that needs to be added when performing a lot of these differentially private algorithms so that the same level of privacy is maintained, but the accuracy loss due to noise being added is lowered. Um, I think both of those will be huge going forward. Another big area that I think will grow, which is more in the field of classical machine learning, is just figuring out how to make models smaller. Especially within federated learning and secure computation, having smaller models means that they're faster to send to other parties, which makes it faster to do the whole algorithm in general.
Great. So, we have a question from Hugo. I've been a Java and Red developer for several years. Lately, I started working in a big data project and I got interest in data science as well. Is there any room for Java developers in data science? How do you think we can start gaining experience in this field? Usually, companies want us to be just to be focused on a specific area. What would be your advice here?
So as far as programming languages in data science, a lot of data science is focused around Python nowadays, just because that's where tooling is. I think we'll see more diversity in programming languages if there's like sort of more familiar tooling in these other languages. As far as Java and PySift, PySift is recently been focusing on adding support for working with Android. So having experience in Java is super helpful in that front. Um, as far as, could you repeat the other question?
Yeah,
Like
sure.
the,
Sure. So the next question was, how do you think we can start gaining experience in the field also? Usually companies want us just focused on a specific area. What is your advice here?
so in a lot of ways, starting to get experience is just starting to write code. Um, for that type of experience. I think Udacity does a wonderful job at providing very accessible courses for starting up learning these technologies. And then in a lot of cases, after you go through a course or learn this technology how you do, writing things to use that code that people can see in the open is very valuable for having experience. Um, I'm a huge proponent of open source software, especially for career development, in that it's very easy to say that, yes, I've done this, and here's where you can see it. Like, hiring is a huge problem in figuring out exactly what people's experience is. And in a lot of cases, having open source code makes it a lot easier because you can just go see it. It's there.
Great. So moving on to the next question. Federated learning is a tough subject to understand. How do you explain and convince the average users that they are protected right now? Example would be I had downloaded the Gboard app in my iPhone earlier, and I believe the warning that it gives will scare the average users.
So I haven't seen the Gboard warning for iPhone, but the main idea about federated learning of how it promotes privacy is that with federated learning, your data doesn't leave your device. Like functions on the data do, which is the trained model, but the data itself doesn't leave. So as long if in a lot of cases, if you have problems with your privacy within the context of federated learning, you probably have problems with your privacy with that model being trained at all. So it's more thinking about, okay, if this data doesn't leave my control, am I okay with what this model is learning? Because since it doesn't leave your control, learning other things isn't possible. That being said, I would love to check out that warning because I imagine it is amusing.
Yeah. Okay, so this question was from Albert. The other question we have is from Eben Bin. What are the important steps to take when deploying federated learning to applications?
So there's a lot of different things to keep in mind. Some of the biggest things to keep in mind are, how is your model going to run on other people's devices? And your federated learning code, how does it work on their devices? Another huge thing to keep in mind is how those devices will communicate with the server where you're doing the federated averaging. In a lot of cases, especially like with the Gboard case, the edge compute devices that have the data come online and offline. And figuring out how to deal with like data that isn't always available is a huge engineering challenge. And like on top of that, just in a lot of cases, you have the engineering challenge of just getting access to remote servers regardless. Uh, which those are a lot of what I keep in mind when thinking about federated learning.
Great.
Another
Um,
yeah, another thing to
okay,
keep in
you
mind
want
in
to
that
add something?
space is also just what people would do with your model. If you think people whose data is being used to train your model will steal your model, it might make more sense to use something like secure computation.
Moving on to the next question, we have a question from Olivia. So how we learn the techniques, but what to do about data sources and entities that we need to have so that we can send our models back and forth privately to them. And the
Um,
other is, I'm a novice. Yeah, really sorry.
could you repeat that
Okay,
question? There was some network delay.
yeah, okay. So I'm repeating it again. So now we have learned techniques. What about the data sources, entities that we need to have so that we can send our models back and forth privately? Did you get the question, Robert?
I'm sorry, it cut out again.
Okay. I believe the question is a little unstructured, so we can come back to it once again. Let's move on to a different question for now.
All right,
Okay.
sounds good.
So we have questions from Ashish. Is it possible to perform a remote code execution from the virtual workers with eyesight? It seems like there might be some possibility to do it.
Um, so I definitely wouldn't rule out the possibility of remote code execution. We've put in a lot of effort to getting it so that the only commands that can be called are valid PyTorch commands, which is a limited subset of what possible commands can be run using something like Python. That being said, going forward, one of our goals is to start having basically hacking competitions on PySift so that people can, in a responsible way, discover those vulnerabilities and we can get them removed. That being said, if you do
Great.
find vulnerabilities like that and you point them out, that would be very, very appreciated.
Awesome. The next question is from Sayed. What are the possibilities of using a Raspberry Pi for distributed learning?
So there's been some wonderful work by people such as Daniel Gadler into getting PySift to run on Raspberry Pis. I think within the PySift repository, you can actually find a demo that's running that you could run on your own devices. I think a lot of these sort of embedded chips, similar to Raspberry Pis, to NVIDIA Jetsons, to like the Google Coral, will be huge going forward with things like federated learning, in that they can live where the data is collected and just do the processing that needs to be done on that data. Um, there's a ton of work being done in that space.
Awesome. Next question is from Alexander. What do you think is the best way, in your experience, how an open source project decides which way to move forward in terms of propositions given by its contributors?
So a lot of times with open source, there's a lot that you want to do that you don't necessarily have time for. Most of the time, it's just spent on focusing on sort of what techniques are important towards the core mission that you set out for. Like with OpenMined, for example, the goal was to promote creating tools to promote privacy preserving machine learning. So whenever we look at proposals for things that we work on, a lot of it just comes down to, okay, how does this help us accomplish the end goal? And does this accomplish any of the other things we're trying to accomplish? Um, that being said, a lot of it also just comes down to personal preference. With most open source software, most people are volunteers. So if somebody volunteers to start working on something, a lot of effort is spent to support them so that they can continue to like develop and write code that is useful.
Great. Just moving on to the last four questions now. We have a question from Shivam. How far can we make it in this field without being a cryptography expert?
Um, so a lot of things with privacy preserving machine learning don't rely on cryptography outside of secure computation. I would describe my background in cryptography as mediocre at best, and I've done okay so far. A lot of it is just, uh, I do end up spending a lot of time just trying to learn sort of the number theoretic background, but that's a lot more just out of personal interest. Um, so you can go pretty far. A lot of things with privacy preserving machine learning just build on classical machine learning as well. So there's a huge different number of ways to continue to work on the field. And if you spend enough time on it, a lot of the background ends up coming to you anyway, just from coming across the same things over and over again, and you start to learn. Yeah.
Great. So move on to the next question. We have a question from Malik Arjuna. How deep learning play a role in human-computer interactions?
So I don't have a huge amount of experience in human-computer interaction, but I imagine going forward, a lot of it just relies on how deep learning plays a role in how humans interact with computers in the same way that any like software that's written does, in that the models that we learn seek to aid our experience in interacting with computers. Take, for example, with like the Gboard example. Uh, the interaction with the keyboard is enhanced in a lot of ways through just better predictive text. So in a lot of ways, the interaction with deep learning is just, does it help make these problems better? Or the solutions to these problems better.
Great. Moving on to the next question. For my final project, I work with a linear dataset because I'm afraid that PySwift cannot handle more complex deep learning models. How complex are the neural networks that PySwift can process?
So in theory, PySwift can process arbitrary complex neural networks. The biggest thing with privacy preserving machine learning and model complexity is just how big the model is for sending over the network and two, how long it takes to run, because there is a speed slowdown using privacy preserving techniques. Um, Personally, I've started working with using PySwift on fairly complicated models, um, like in the order of like millions to billions of parameters. So I don't think that should be overly a concern going forward. It more just becomes a balancing act of how long does this take to train, and like how much network bandwidth you have.
Great. Second last question. Last question of the day today. We have a question from Saurav Kumar. It's kind of like the repeated one from our fourth last. Will learning cryptography help us in better understanding differential privacy and methods used for securing data while training neural networks?
So with learning differential privacy, a wonderful resource for that is Cynthia Dwork's book. Cynthia Dwork was the first author on the paper that introduced differential privacy in the first place. And it does a wonderful job of explaining the core concepts. Kind of as just an intuitive take on it, differential privacy works by just adding noise, basically, in that when you want something to be more private, you add a bit of noise to it and try to add as little noise as possible to give a bit of ambiguity into what the true value is.
Great. That wraps us our questions that we used earlier to give to our students. And thank you so much for your answers, Robert. I think this was a really informative session. We still have around 5 minutes left. I think we can move on to the chat now. And if there are any questions that our live students have currently, maybe we can take up maybe 4 or 5 of those and answer them right now. That makes sense?
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Guys, I will now be accepting your questions in the chat window. So, guys, please just start answering questions. Start asking your questions there, and Robert will be answering those live here right now.
So one question that I see on my screen in the chat window is Kush Patel is asking, can you share the importance of a mentor while contributing to open source, and how can we reach out to them? In my personal experience, mentors sort of arose organically, in that when I was contributing to open source, I started interacting with people more and more who, in a lot of cases, had more experience than I did. They've been very helpful in that, like, they were there to give advice when I needed it. But sort of how I reached out to them was more of just starting working with them, and those relationships arose organically. In a lot of cases, as well with people with more experience, is most people like to talk about the work that they're doing. So like if you see a paper that you think is interesting and like you have some questions about it, like emailing the author is always a great way to find out more. And in a lot of ways, depending on how the question goes, it can arise into more of a mentoring relationship.
Awesome. Taking up Suman's question here, what is the biggest problem privacy community is facing right now?
So there, I talked about this a little bit earlier. Some of the like within secure computation, by far the biggest problem is speed, and finding ways to make it faster to be more on parity with plain text machine learning. As far as with differential privacy, in my personal opinion, sort of the biggest avenues of research are figuring out how to minimize the accuracy loss due to like promoting this privacy while still maintaining that level of privacy.
Great. On the question from Hugo here, so the third last question of the session, guys. Um, do you usually work with data stored in a data lake, or usually you download CSV files to work with?
So for Me, it varies. In a lot of times when I'm working on developing for PySift, for example, most of the time the data is pretty small and it's just like downloading like MNIST, for example. Um, Prior to my current role, I was a software engineering intern at Yelp. And in that case, it was dealing with a lot of data in a data lake. So it really depends. In a lot of cases, the data kind of tells that to you based on how it's stored. Um, yeah.
Great. So the second last question we have from Ashish. What are some computer vision areas where private AI can be applied?
Um, so with a lot of cases with um, private machine learning, is there's sort of a set of things that need to be accomplished before you can do private machine learning, mostly which is getting the data in a way that you can learn from it. In practice, this means getting the data labeled. So with computer vision, the biggest thing is finding data that either naturally labels itself or having it so that people label their own data, which is how that can play into private AI.
Great. Okay, the last question of the day, Robert. Uh, how can I combine computational neuroscience and differential privacy experiences, which I'm gaining right now?
So, as far as the big advantage of things like differential privacy is that it means that when you release the model, it's harder to reconstruct the data inputs for the model. So, in a lot of cases, the way that intersects with computational neuroscience is if you're learning models about like the brain, for example, that you intend to release to the public, but don't want people to be able to learn things about the input data set, that's where it comes in. So it's more a question of what's going to happen with this model after it's trained, and if it's going to be accessed by people who want to gain information from it, then that's where differential privacy comes in.
Great. Whew, I think that was a lot of questions, and it was more like a fireside chat instead of ask me anything session. I'm really sorry for that, but thank you so much, Robert, for joining us and answering all of those important questions that our students had. And I'm sure our students have a lot of more questions, and maybe we can do more of these webinars in the future with you. But right now, I'm really grateful for you joining in and giving this insight to our students. I think this was really informative for them and definitely help them in the future in the program.
Thank you for having me. If people have more questions going forward, I'm very active on the OpenMined Slack, and can be reached there if people have more specific questions.
Absolutely. So I think after this session, we'll be sharing the link to the OpenMined Slack workspace once again, guys. So if you want to actually go to that workspace and reach out to Robert for any particular questions, please feel free to do that. And please don't bug him much and try to keep the questions as as normal and as small as possible. Okay, guys. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Robert, for doing this for the students for securing
No
private
problem.
exams.
And just kind of as a closing, I would also like to plug the RISE grants again for getting funding to contribute to OpenMined. I'll see if I can put a link in the chat after this is over,
Um,
so that people can apply.
Awesome. So maybe you can just give the link to me because I think the chat does not accept the link, and I can share that link with the students afterwards.
All right, sounds good. I'll send it your way. All right,
Awesome. Okay, guys. Once again, thank you so much for joining in, and stay dashes. Bye, guys.
all right. Bye. Thank you for having me.
Bye.